Okay, we're going to start by editing the material for the terrain and adding an ecosystem to it. So we can double click on the material to open it up. We're going to note the scale we currently have, add an ecosystem layer. Just by converting the material itself to an ecosystem adds an ecosystem layer. If you wanted to add additional ecosystem layers, you can select that base material, the bottom one, click ecosystem again, it'll add another ecosystem layer. So if we take a look at the scale, we need to change this scale to 1 for the ecosystem and the scale to 4, where we had it before, on the original base layer. Top layer, also we want the scale to 1, since now we're defining that scale of 4 on the base material. So we're going to pick out some trees to add to this ecosystem, and I'm going to add in a plant. And I'm going to use some of the trees that have come with View. I'm going to start out by using the yellow maple tree, and then add in another plant, the red maple tree. And I also want to add a couple of trees that don't have any leaves on them. So there are different variations. There are the winter trees, also some of the leafless trees. Since we don't have a very large scene, we don't need to worry about the high polygon counts associated with some of these. There's also the large dead tree, which is a much older tree. It doesn't have as many branches, so there's also that as an option. Let's go through and just pick out the leafless tree up and click OK. It might take a little bit longer to load in some of the higher res trees as ecosystem instances, because it does need to prepare the OpenGL preview and load all of the materials and other areas of the plants into the scene. So I want to make an adjustment to the present setting. We don't want as many dead trees as there are the other ones, so I'll set the presence to 0.2. And I also want to use a realistic scale, real-world scale. So I'm going to set my overall scaling to 1, because by default it'll set it to 0.5, which is half of normal scale. And now we can click Populate, and we're going to see there are 18 instances, or 18 plants showing up in the scene. So not a whole lot. I'm going to go to the density and increase it up to 65% and repopulate. Click OK. And we can see the current scene. Of course, it's very dark. Overall, what we're seeing behind the leaves, it's not quite bright enough. So we're going to make some modifications to the lighting and the setup of the light. First thing I'm going to do is select the sunlight, and up at the top here we can select where we have the shadow options. If we right click on this button, we can edit shadows, which is going to open the light editor, and I'm going to take the shadow density and bring it down to 65%. What we can also do is, instead of using the harsher shadows, we can use a soft shadow map. So I'm going to use shadow map, select the soft shadow map option, click on auto size. There's another option too if you're using the ray trace shadows, and that is to adjust the softness of the light, which will modify the light shadows. It does require a lot higher of a render setting, though, to get a smooth edge around the blurred part of the shadow. So now we're using shadow maps, and we have a much softer shadow, but still the diffuse area of the trees is not quite bright enough. Not exactly what I want. So I'm going to go to Atmosphere, Atmosphere Editor, and now that we're using an HDRI, an environment mapping mode rather than the spectral model, we can adjust the light intensity without affecting the look of the sky. So just the scene itself. I'm going to take our ambient light and bring it down to 40%, and I'm increasing the light intensity to 0.6. And it's something that brightens up a little bit more. Now I do want to use a better lighting mode in order to get the HDRI to affect the scene, because with global ambience it's not really going to have any impact. It's just going to show up in the background. And instead want to use radiosity, which is a bouncing of light from the sky and also the ground and the objects in the scene onto each other. And I'm going to reduce the quality boost for now down to -1.5 just for some faster rendering. Another thing I want to do is turn off the Optimize for Outdoor Rendering option. Now, normally you'd want to leave this on for large ecosystem scenes where you're up in the sky, but once you start getting into more of an enclosed area, and in this case we're sort of in the woods, we want to make sure that this option is off so we get the correct lighting options. It will take a little bit longer to render than the other mode, but it will look much better and take a better calculation of the light. So now we can see a much better glow on the leaves. And the ground itself is fairly dark. We might need to maybe increase some of the lighting options on the material to brighten it up a little bit. But overall it's starting to look a lot better. We can see in the preview render that the dead tree is really kind of small. I do want to increase the size of it. So we're going to go over to our Material tab, select our ecosystem material. We can double click to go straight to that ecosystem layer. And I'm going to increase the size of this tree to a scale of 2. So doubling its size. And it will also reduce the amount of trees that are in the scene because that scale on the X and the Y is going to impact the spacing. So with having a larger tree in this scene, we now will also need to increase the density in order to get more of that wood look back, being in the woods. So we'll open and back up the material, increase density, and populate. I also want to note that decay near foreign objects is currently on. What this does is it creates a fall off or cutoff for plants to be generated. Since the ground plane is intersecting with the terrain, it is acting as a foreign object. If it's not part of the material, or it doesn't have the material applied to it, it is a foreign object. Now, we can choose to turn off decay near foreign objects, but if we have other objects in the scene we want to use to decay that fall off, then what we can do is ignore specific objects. So if we select the ground and go up here to the top, we have a couple of different options, and one of them we can see, first one is going to be hide from the render. The second is going to be occlude from the G buffer. The next is to ignore the object when populating an ecosystem. So this object no longer has an impact on decay near foreign objects. The next is to ignore indirect lighting. That option is also available within the main top panel here, where we can ignore lighting. In this case, it's just indirect lighting. This will ignore lighting completely. Since we've made our change, we need to repopulate. What I'm going to do is turn on dynamic population. So when I render, it's going to figure out where these plants need to go. And since I have the option to show dynamic ecosystems, it's going to preview them and show them in the scene. We can also see there's a big trunk right in front of where our camera is currently at. The camera does not act as an object to decay, and it will not be a foreign object. Cameras are not included within that. There are a couple of ways to make sure that around the camera no objects are being populated, but it will require a fixed, fully populated ecosystem, and rather than not using dynamic population at the moment, I am going to keep this kind of where it's at and just move the camera slightly. Okay, so let's take a look at a slightly higher quality render, put it on final mode, and render this out. So now we can see that overall the lighting balance is pretty good. The ground, however, the shadows are really dark, and I think a little bit too dark. The more we move towards ambient, it's going to darken the scene, and we would need to increase some of those values. Also adjust maybe gain setting for the radiosity. What I'm going to choose to do is modify the intensity of the shadow instead, and bring it to a value of 45%. If I do just a quick preview, we'll see it is lightening up a little bit more. I may need to increase some of the light settings on the material. But first I'm going to make a couple of changes to the atmosphere. Go to Atmosphere Editor, select the fog and haze, and I'm going to start to bring in some haze and some fog. And this is going to impact only the objects in the scene. We can adjust the fall-off settings and the color of the haze. I'm going to kind of stick with the defaults and just bring a little bit of fog, a little bit of haze, and just make sure that Ignore Atmosphere on Map is turned on. We can also darken the atmosphere if needed, maybe decreasing the exposure if we wanted a little bit of a darker sky. And under the lighting, we can either bring it a little more towards ambient, or just increase the gain. Sky dome lighting gain isn't going to really have that large of an impact, but the quality boost will, now that we're working with a closer scene. I'm going to increase the gain of the radiosity and the bouncing of light. And let's go ahead and just take a look at a render now. And the diffused lighting is looking a little bit better. The lighting of the sky might need to be modified. But let's go ahead and just move on and take a look at some of the other ecosystem effects and layering options we have available. So we're going to select the terrain, double-click to open the material. And for this, I am going to turn off dynamic population and repopulate just for the moment. We're going to select the original layer and then select ecosystem to add a new ecosystem layer. I'm then going to move it up above the existing ecosystem layer. And we're going to use this layer to create leaves to populate on the ground, so that we have some leaves that have fallen off the trees and are covering the ground. At the moment, there aren't any available plants that already have this set up. And I am going to have to change the material scale of that new ecosystem layer. And it looks like at the moment, it is not allowing me to populate. So let's take a look at the Environment tab, and it looks like the environment settings have been slightly changed. So I am going to open up the slope range, the altitude range, go to that new layer and do the same. And we can populate. And I just want to show you that I did manage to crash the application, possibly because there were no plants on the other layer when I tried to populate the one underneath it. If not, it's a bug, current pre-release. So what I want to do is just make a note of that so you know why the scene we're about to look at in a sec might be slightly different. Okay, and since I didn't save previously, I did just recreate the settings I just showed you. So the scene may look slightly different, but I am using the regular population now. I was able to populate it. One thing I'm going to do is change some of the material names. So in the material for the terrain, I'm just going to call this grass for the base layer, and then we'll say maples for that first ecosystem layer. And like I was saying before, we don't really have any plants that are going to work directly for creating leaves on the ground. So we need to create our own custom modified plant in order to create leaves on the ground. There are different ways you could do it. Technically, you could, we'll go ahead and take a look, open up the material, go to the ecosystem, and under density, we have the ability to offset the leaves from, or the population from the surface. So I could select proportional from the size of instance and populate it below the surface. And one thing you could do is just kind of squish down your trees a little and make the leaves really showing up from the surface. That is one way that it can be done, but probably not the best unless you wanted piles of leaves, and in that case, either way, it's just not really going to work. But that is an option you do have if you wanted to go above the surface. It's kind of neat. Using proportional to the size of instance seems to work the best, because otherwise it's an absolute offset. Of course, it really depends on what you're doing, what you're using it for. Now everything is going to be a little more even, but not based on the scale. So it really depends. So we'll just set it to 0, go back to that regular look, and what we can do is customize any plants we have. Now, I first want to show you that if we go to the Library tab, which is the tab we haven't really looked at yet, what we can see are the 3 different trees I have loaded into the ecosystem population. When you're using dynamic population, these won't show up. But if you're using just that fixed population where you're populating and sticking with it, and you're not worrying about the dynamic population, then you can access each of these different plants. You can also edit them. So I could just double click, and it's going to open up the plant editor, and now what I can do is make some changes. We'll adjust the flexibility of some of these leaves, and I'm going to gnarl this tree a little bit more, maybe adjust the length. So now the yellow maples will be slightly taller. We can adjust the angle of the branches, click OK, and what it's going to do is create a new species preview, because we're technically kind of creating a new plant species. And then what we have in the scene at the moment is a proxy object that represents what's going to be in the ecosystem. Once we move away from this tab, this proxy object will be removed, but at the moment it allows us to go back and edit the object. It will not render, it's just there as the geometry, creating a plant for the scene to edit. And once we move away, it'll be removed. Also, if we take a look, we'll see that new yellow maple tree, the taller one. We can repopulate and start to see that showing up in the scene. Because of the scale difference, it will modify where the positions are. But now we can see a much taller yellow maple showing up in the scene. So this is a great way to edit ecosystem objects without having to load in a separate plant. And if we go to the Links tab, we can also modify their materials. So that's pretty cool.